What we know is that there are more bacterial cells in our GI tract than there are human cells in the body. It appears as if a lot of the effects of food on our body are mediated by the effect of food on the gut microbiome. A lot of bacteria thrive on the presence of fiber. We know that high fiber diets are associated with better health and longevity. Not only better gut function, but general cardiac, better heart function, decreased risk of stroke, less inflammation in the body. Almost all of that effect has to do with the impact of fiber on the gut microbiome, which then creates those substances that are responsible for the effects of fiber. Researchers discovered that in order for mice and rats to get obese when fed a Western human-type diet, they needed a microbiome. If they didn't have a microbiome, you could overfeed these rats, they would not get fat. You get changes in the gut microbiome, you get inflammation in the body, and you get a phenomenon called leaky gut, which is related to the inflammatory changes in the microbiome. There's a role for prebiotics, probiotics, and what are called postbiotics. The first step towards establishing a healthy gut microbiome is a diet that is
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm Matthew. I'm here every week talking health and well-being. If those are subjects that interest you, you're in the right place. If you're already familiar with this podcast and would like to show your support, it is free and it'll take you 2 seconds. Like, subscribe, and share with other people. Tell other folk in your life all about this podcast because they may find it interesting too. And if you're on YouTube, become a subscriber over there. So many people are enjoying these episodes but haven't subscribed to date on YouTube. So if that is you, well then click that subscribe button, and you can also hit the like button, click that bell notification for future videos, and share. Sharing is caring. In this episode today, I am speaking with Dr. Leo Galland. He is an internationally recognized world leader in integrated medicine and a founder of functional medicine. We explore the importance of gut bacteria to our overall health. I ask what leaky gut is and why it is a significant condition. Discover why diet is so crucial for the optimum functioning of the gut and by extension to our overall health. Find out why the very presence of gut bacteria is key to the development of obesity. Plus, we explore our bacteria's role in systemic inflammation, dietary fiber, and if you should be taking prebiotics. We also talk about the low histamine diet and lots more besides. I hope you enjoy. Let's dive straight in and find out exactly what the gut and the gut bacteria does as far as its impact on our systemic health, and then what kind of conditions arise whenever we experience an impaired gut function.
There are a lot of questions there. We'll start with an understanding of what's called the microbiome, which includes more than bacteria, but probably the best studied component in the gut are the bacteria. So what we know is there are more bacterial cells in our GI tract than there are human cells in the body. And, like roughly 100 trillion. Most of them are in the large intestine, the colon, and there's good evidence that they impact our health in 3 ways. Just as far as a little background goes, close to 95% of the chemicals circulating in our blood originate with the microbiome. They may be modified by our own cells, but we don't create them. They're actually created by the microbes in the gut. Humans have about 26,000 genes that are active. That's a very small number compared to a lot of other species and plants. Rice, for example, has over 40,000 genes that are active. So how do we get to be so complex? Researchers who look at this think it's because there are 4 million bacterial genes in our microbiome, and that they interact with our genes to create the tremendous amount of diversity, behavioral and biological, that's characteristic of being a human. Now, there are 3 well-studied ways in which, there's probably more. There's always another way. But I'd say 4 ways that it's important for people to know about in which the bacteria in the gut impact your health. One is bacteria create something called inflammation. When our cells encounter bacterial cells, we respond with a kind of inflammatory reaction. That is normal in the GI tract. The GI tract is a place of natural low-grade inflammation in the body. And this educates our immune system. About 2/3 of our immune cells are in the lining of the small intestine at any time. They don't necessarily live there all the time. They're passing through, they're getting educated, and they're moving back onto other parts of the body. There's this constant circulation. So that's kind of like school for them. And there are other ways in which the inflammatory reactions in the gut impact our sleep cycle and help to maintain a natural sleep cycle because of the way that inflammation then affects our nervous system. But that involves the mediation of inflammation impacting the nervous system. And this is a normal, healthy, inflammatory response that's constantly being modulated. And it interacts with the adrenal glands, and this is like a symphony, okay? Or they're just networks and interactions. That's number one. Number two, as I mentioned, these gut bacteria produce most of the chemicals that we find circulating in our blood. Now, some of these chemicals have direct beneficial or toxic effects in the body. On the beneficial side, there are these substances called short-chain fatty acids, of which the most studied is something called butyrate. And butyrate is volatile. It readily passes through cell membranes. It's produced by gut bacteria, and it's increased on a high-fiber diet, decreased on a very low-fiber diet. It has anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer effects in the gut itself, but it readily diffuses into your body, even gets to your brain. And in your brain, butyrate has some very interesting effects. Butyrate actually, it's a very simple molecule, only 4 carbons long, but it acts to alter gene expression. And when there's an injury in the brain or some kind of stress, it could be an infection, a stroke, the recovery from that injury requires the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. Well, the gene for that is ordinarily turned off. You don't need much of it. But butyrate activates that gene. So in order to recover from a head injury, you need gut bacteria. And there are studies looking at the relationship between gut bacteria and the effects of head trauma. That's just one example of a beneficial substance produced by gut bacteria gets into the brain. There are 2 substances that have been well studied that are quite toxic to the brain and can cause delirium, panic disorder, may contribute to chronic fatigue, confusion. One of these is called D-lactic acid. Lactic acid, most people know about. It's used in some skin creams. It's produced in our bodies under extreme exercise conditions. But that's L-lactic acid. That's the normal variety. D-lactic acid is a neurotoxin. It's only produced by certain species of bacteria. So ammonia is another one. Ordinarily, ammonia is detoxified in the liver. If there's anything wrong with your liver, the ammonia can get to your brain. There are a wide range of chemicals like that with specific beneficial or toxic effects on our cells. The third mechanism has to do with neurotransmitters and hormones and the nervous system. Gut bacteria respond to our hormones. They also secrete hormones that are exactly like ours. Different species make things like adrenaline or serotonin or other dopamine, other neurotransmitter or hormone-like substances that impact the way our cells function and the way our bodies function. This is only beginning to be looked at, and it's definitely a two-way street. That is, adrenaline in our bodies, when you're under stress, your immune system takes a hit. That's well established. But at the same time, there are certain bacteria in the gut, like E. coli, toxic strains of E. coli that become more toxic under the effects of our adrenaline. So there's this constant give and take and interaction between our cells and all the networks and systems in our body and this incredibly diverse network of microbes in the gut.
It's extraordinary, the complexity of the human body and how this symbiotic relationship that the human body has with these bacteria can be advantageous on the one hand, it can be deleterious on the other whenever you're talking about toxins. Can we talk about diet? I'm really interested in the impact that diet has on the gut bacteria and the optimum functioning of the gut.
It's a very important question. And actually, that's the fourth mechanism. It appears as if a lot of the effects of food on our body are mediated by the effect of food on the gut microbiome. I mean, it's true, we need calories, we need minerals and vitamins for our enzymes to function properly, but a lot of the other effects of food, which have been shown to impact human health, have seemed to have a lot to do with the relationship between the food and the gut microbiome and how our diet shapes the microbiome and how the microbiome metabolizes the food that we're eating to create substances that then influence us. Fiber is one important example of that. Fiber are basically polysaccharides that cannot be digested the way that ordinary starch is digested. So it passes through the gut, gets to the large intestine, where the bacteria thrive. A lot of bacteria thrive on the presence of fiber. We know that high fiber diets are associated with better health and longevity, as well, not only better gut function, but general cardiac, better heart function, decreased risk of stroke, less inflammation in the body. Almost all of that effect has to do with the impact of fiber on the gut microbiome, which then creates those substances that are responsible for the effects of fiber. The other category of nutrients are what I would call, or what's been called polyphenols. They include things like bioflavonoids. They're complex molecules that are present mostly in plants that have been shown to have very significant effects, anti-allergic, anti-inflammatory. Polyphenols interact in multiple ways with the gut bacteria. They sort of shape, they act as curators of the microbiome, but then the microbiome alters them and makes some of them more bioavailable. A lot of the polyphenols don't readily get into, are not readily well absorbed. And so there's this complex set of interactions between these food components that are really important for health, but are not vitamins and minerals and calories. I mean, they have other characteristics that are important, shaping the microbiome to be healthy, and then creating health in our bodies. And the first step towards establishing a healthy gut microbiome is a diet that is nutrient dense, that is, there's not a lot of empty calories from sugar or fat in it, that is high in fiber, the undigestible carbohydrates, and very rich in polyphenols from vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and herbs and spices. And spices are a really important source of the polyphenols.
Is the gut microbiome implicated in the proliferation of the systemic inflammation that people are seeing all over the world from consuming a high carbohydrate diet?
Oh, yeah. There definitely is a relationship. First of all, let's just say that diet impacts inflammation. I've written about this in a book, in a review for a nutrition journal, and reviewed the different aspects of diet that affect inflammation. The way that the diet affects the microbiome plays a really critical role. And this is when the microbiome research really started to get, there was interest that started in it about 20 years ago. I mean, I've been looking at it for 40 years and it was kind of considered, it's pretty oddball stuff. But when researchers discovered that in order for mice and rats to get obese when fed a Western human type diet, they needed a microbiome. And if they didn't have a microbiome, you could overfeed these rats, they would not get fat. And so it was clear that what was happening was that this typical Western diet with added fat and added sugar, I mean, the normal diet of a mouse or a rat is a low-fat vegan diet. That's what they're feeding them in laboratories. You start adding extra fat, start adding sugar, some animal protein to, replicate a meal at McDonald's or someplace like that. You start getting you get changes in the gut microbiome, you get inflammation in the body, and you get a phenomenon called leaky gut, which is related to the inflammatory changes in the microbiome. With a leaky gut, there's a kind of porosity to the gut, to the lining of the gut, that allows toxic substances in the gut to get into your body. And so with that realization, a lot of concepts that had been considered really out there, way out there, the leaky gut, the gut dysbiosis, really started to attract attention. Because if you've got something that's going to cure obesity, you'll make $1 trillion. So why wouldn't all sorts of companies try to research that? They still haven't cracked the code there, by the way. Because there's just the level of complexity. I mean, it's like rocket science meets quantum physics. We have a long way to go in really being able to fine tune responses, but there's a lot of research going.
Well, we've spoken about diet, we've spoken about fiber. Can we move to this question? Is there a role for exogenous pre and probiotic supplementation, or should we just rely on whole foods specifically?
Diet is certainly the foundation of almost anything that you're going to do, not only to impact your gut, but to reverse disease and create health. And sometimes diet is the only thing you need to address, and sometimes it's just it's the concrete that you build on. But there's a role for prebiotics, probiotics, and what are called postbiotics, and that needs to be customized and individualized. Probiotics, which have been around the longest, are bacteria that have beneficial effects, and they could be taken either in food like yogurt, for example, or kimchi or fermented foods. Those naturally have lactobacilli in them. Ordinarily, there's only a little bit of lactobacillus in the gut if you're not having fermented foods of some kind, but they can have very profound effects. There are a number of species that are available as probiotics, and they may have very distinct effects. Sometimes one strain of a particular species has a different effect than another strain of that species. Some produce histamine, some break down histamine, and may impact on whether you have pseudo-allergic reactions to food, for example, because of histamine. That's gotten a lot of attention lately, the need for a low histamine diet in some situations. So different strains of bacteria may have different metabolic effects. So prebiotics are basically carbohydrates that stimulate the growth of kind of specific bacterial species. The one that's been the most studied is fructooligosaccharides, but there's several others. The galactooligosaccharides in human milk profoundly shape the microbiome of of a breastfeeding infant, and they encourage the growth of bifidobacteria, which have anti-inflammatory effects and other kinds of healing effects in the GI tract, and are really important for the healthy development of infants. Postbiotics are things like butyrate, substances produced by the gut bacteria that are then helpful to your body. And I would say butyrate is probably the postbiotic that's been the most studied, and is the most readily available as a supplement. And there are a number of studies indicating significant clinical benefits of either pre, pro, or postbiotics in different situations. For people who are otherwise basically healthy, probiotics and some prebiotics have been shown to help prevent allergies and respiratory infections, for example.
You mentioned the histamine diet there. Could I just dig into that just very briefly and ask you what foods you should prioritize if you're thinking of prescribing to a histamine diet?
Okay, so the first question actually before that is, why should you even think about that? Okay, so there are people who are experiencing symptoms that are a little hard to understand. Why am I getting these symptoms? Often they're provoked by food, but they don't seem to be allergic to the food. The symptoms may be allergic or appear somewhat allergic, but sometimes it's just fatigue or brain fog. And a condition that can cause this, that's been getting increasing attention over the past decade or so, is something called histamine intolerance. There's an amino acid in food called histidine that is converted to histamine. There are microbes in your gut that produce histamine. There are some foods in which the histamine conversion has already occurred, like aged canned fish and aged cheeses and some fermented foods. This is a situation in which fermented foods might actually make you sick rather than better because of the presence of histamine. Normally, this problem of histamine intolerance starts in the gut. And what happens is with inflammation in the gut or an abnormal gut microbiome, you get an excessive production of histamine or consumption of histamine from food. And you lack the enzyme that breaks it down. Normally, there is an enzyme in the gut called DAO, diamine oxidase, that breaks down histamine. So you don't get those kind of reactions. But if there's anything that is interfering with the activity of DAO, it could be certain antibiotics. It may be the effects of inflammation. It may be a deficiency of copper, which is the essential mineral for DAO activity. Then you don't break down the histamine. And so there are systemic effects of that. This is a condition, this is not generally like a genetic disorder or one that you're born with. It's one that develops as a result of problems in the GI tract, and then it aggravates those problems. So high histamine foods, anything that's aged or fermented, a lot of fish and seafood. There are lists that have been compiled. They're not always the same from different centers. So I won't go into all of the details now because sometimes that is subject to change.
When I mentioned I was going to be speaking with you today, somebody asked me to ask you about gastric reflux and what was the cause of this. Was this related to the microbiome also? Because so many people out there suffer from reflux and have to take antacids as a result. So.
There is definitely an interaction between the microbiome and reflux. I haven't yet seen anything that would indicate that the microbiome is a primary cause of reflux, unless it's yeast overgrowth, because yeast definitely can create a reflux situation. Basically, what happens with reflux, there's a very wide misunderstanding of reflux. The sort of cartoon thinking about it is, oh, there's too much acid in the stomach, and that's why you get acid indigestion. That's not the case. Often there's not even enough acid, and most of the time they're normal amounts. Reflux is a motility disorder in which the esophagus does not contract normally, and the lower the valve at the end of the esophagus, between the esophagus and the stomach, is weakened, and it does not. It opens when it should be closed, and this allows the contents of the stomach to come back up into the chest, and produce inflammation. Now, that will begin to alter the microbiome in the esophagus. Also, if you use acid-suppressing drugs, that will alter the microbiome in the whole GI tract and also in the upper GI tract and in the esophagus. Ordinarily, what regulates the normal function of the esophagus is calcium, which is where the use of calcium as a supplement may be helpful. But there's a wide misunderstanding about that. People think these calcium supplements are there as antacids. They're terrible antacids. They don't really work as antacids. They're working by supplying an external source of calcium. So you have to know how to use them properly. And of course, once you've gotten into this cycle of relying on acid suppression to relieve the symptoms, it can be very hard to get out of that, because now you're really screwing up the microbiome. You might be increasing the inflammation. You could develop a dependency on these acid suppressors. As soon as you try stopping them, you get an acid rebound. They did a study once with college students, took about a bunch of guys, put them on omeprazole for 30 days. These were totally healthy young men, had no symptoms, no GI symptoms at all. They took omeprazole for a month and then stopped it. 30% of them started getting heartburn after they stopped it, because they were getting this, because the drug itself had created the problem.
Seeing as we're talking all things bacteria, the microbiome today, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the huge increase in the use of prescription antibiotics today. We've heard many medics say that they are doled out too liberally by other medical professionals. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think all scientists and researchers who have looked at this issue would agree that there's an overprescribing of antibiotics. Sometimes, though, there may be an underprescribing. And the thing about antibiotics is they have had a revolutionary effect on healthcare. They are vitally important, but bacteria are smarter than we are, and they know how to develop resistance to them. And if you start taking antibiotics, you will alter the composition of the gut microbiome, because the organisms that are sensitive get killed off. That creates space for organisms that are resistant. This problem of antimicrobial resistance is a major one. In addition, I mean, that's one aspect of the antibiotic problem. The other is that the antibiotics can alter the gut microbiome in ways that were not expected or anticipated and not desirable. So they really need to be used very judiciously and clearly targeted. And there's a tendency with a lot of things in medicine for decisions to be made vaguely. Try to, take this and, instead of really trying to fine tune it.
Do you believe that there is a link between someone's mental health and the makeup of their gut microbiome? I've done a little bit of reading, and there seems to be, the suggestion is that the microbiome can increase someone's propensity towards suffering from depression, for example. Would you go along with this assertion?
Sure. There's a lot of research on that. I published an article about in 2013 called The Gut Microbiome in the Brain, and really devoted to looking at the impact of changes in the microbiome on the function of the brain.
Final question for you is this: given everything that you have researched and studied down through the years in this particular area, and given the massive impact that the gut bacteria has on our physical and our psychological health, Do you think even at this point in 2024 that the people at large in the medical field still undervalues the significance and the impact that gut health has on our overall health?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the situation has changed, but it hasn't. There's still an underappreciation, in part because the way it works in the US, and I'm sure it's that way in other countries, is if there's a prescription drug that can fix a problem, doctors will take that seriously. Otherwise, it gets pushed aside.
Well, that's certainly something I've heard more than once on this podcast. So you're singing from the same hymn sheet as other people have. I just mention one of your books? You've written many books, but the allergy solution is just one of them. I will put a link to all of your books in the show notes of this episode. But thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Leo Galland. Really appreciate your thoughts.
Good to speak with you.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. Remember, if you're enjoying these episodes, please like, subscribe, and share news of the podcast with other people who you think might enjoy and get value from these episodes too. And if you're on YouTube, we're aiming for 3,000 subscribers in the coming weeks, and perhaps you can help me get there. Until next time, stay happy.